It was a typical October morning in Greeley, Colorado, but for Tina Sandoval, it was the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare. The air was crisp as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a dim light over the quiet suburban neighborhood. John Sandoval, Tina's husband, left the house for work as usual. Tina kissed him goodbye, not knowing it would be the last time. At around noon, when Tina's friends couldn't reach her by phone, concerns started to rise. She had always been dependable, a creature of habit. It wasn't like her to go silent. By 3 p.m., when John returned home, Tina was nowhere to be found. At first, he didn't panic. He assumed she'd gone out to run errands. But as evening drew closer, and there was still no word from Tina, John's calm demeanor began to slip. By nightfall, he contacted the authorities, reporting her as missing. The police arrived at their home, asking the usual questions about last interactions and routines. John's responses were at first routine, almost too routine. His account was that Tina had left earlier that morning, without any indication that she was planning to disappear. "She's always been independent," he said. "Maybe she just needed a break." But Detective Monroe, who had been called to investigate, wasn't buying the story. As the hours passed, something about John's behavior struck him as strange. He wasn't exhibiting the panic one might expect from a husband whose wife had gone missing under such mysterious circumstances. Instead, John seemed oddly calm, almost as though he were hiding something. Monroe noticed a few things. First, the house was eerily clean. No sign of struggle. Nothing seemed out of place, but that only made the situation more unsettling. Tina's personal belongings, the ones she would never leave behind, were still in their places. Her purse, keys, and phone were all left untouched. If she had left, it was planned, but why would she leave everything behind? The evening continued with no signs of Tina, and as the night grew darker, Monroe started to piece together more unsettling details. One of Tina's friends, Sarah, had stopped by earlier that afternoon. Tina had been acting strange lately, she told Monroe. She'd been talking about needing space, but not like she was leaving for good. Something felt off. She mentioned she didn't feel safe around John anymore, but she didn't say why. This was the first sign that something deeper might be going on in the Sandoval household. It was subtle, but it hinted at a pattern that could explain Tina's sudden disappearance. Monroe felt a growing unease. Something wasn't right. John's calm demeanor in the face of his wife's disappearance felt like a mask. But what was he hiding? Was it simply a case of a wife leaving her husband? Or was something more sinister at play? Was this the work of a troubled marriage unraveling? Or something much darker? As the hours turned into days, the search for Tina intensified. But with every passing moment, the questions grew. Was Tina's disappearance voluntary, or had something far more dangerous occurred? The more Monroe observed John, the more convinced he became that the answers were buried beneath layers of lies and deceit. Detective Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with John Sandoval. The initial investigation was moving at a pace that left him unsatisfied. There were too many loose ends, too many inconsistencies in John's story. John had appeared calm when reporting Tina's disappearance. Too calm. The more Monroe observed him, the more his suspicions deepened. Most husbands, especially those who genuinely cared, would be frantic, desperate to find their wife. But not John. He was detached, almost emotionless, as though he had rehearsed the events he was narrating. His calmness wasn't the grief-stricken demeanor one would expect. As Monroe continued his questioning, John's responses were quick, almost too rehearsed. "She probably just needed a break," he said again, shrugging as if to dismiss the entire situation. "She's always been independent." But there was a problem with that. Tina wasn't the kind of person to just vanish without a word. She had responsibilities. She had 2 children, a family who loved her, and a job she couldn't simply leave behind without a trace. Something didn't add up. Monroe noticed a few things during his conversations with John. Tina's things were still in place. Her purse, her phone, even her car parked in the driveway. If Tina had left, why would she leave behind the essentials? Her life wasn't one she could walk away from easily. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of foul play, at least not physically. But that didn't mean it wasn't there, buried beneath the surface. The first break came when Monroe spoke with Sarah, Tina's close friend. Her words were quiet, almost hesitant, but they carried weight. Tina had been acting different lately, Sarah confessed, eyes darting nervously. She'd been talking about leaving, not in a way that meant I'm gone for good. But there was something in her voice. She was scared. That was the turning point. Sarah spoke of Tina's increasing fear about her marriage. She mentioned Tina's discomfort with John, hinting at a growing unease. I didn't want to believe it, but she mentioned that if anything happened to her, it was John, Sarah whispered. Monroe's gut tightened. Tina had been scared. She had been preparing for something, a break, a separation. No, it felt deeper than that. It was almost as if she had known something terrible was about to happen. But what? And why hadn't she told anyone? The tension around John's behavior mounted as the days passed. Monroe gathered more evidence, piecing together a chilling picture of the Sandovals' troubled marriage. A few neighbors recalled hearing heated arguments between John and Tina just days before her disappearance. Some described John as overbearing, while others used the word intimidating. The sense that John was hiding something grew stronger with each new revelation. Detective Monroe began digging into John's past. A deeper look into his background unearthed a string of previous failed relationships, all with one striking commonality: abusive tendencies. The more Monroe unearthed, the more the pieces started to fit together. John Sandoval was not the man he pretended to be. His calm demeanor was just that, a mask. Beneath it lay a history of control, manipulation, and violence. And now, Tina had become the latest victim in a pattern that Monroe had only begun to uncover. But the true question still lingered. If John had a history of violence, could he have been capable of something even darker this time? Could he have gone as far as to murder Tina, bury her, and then act like nothing had happened? Monroe wasn't ready to accuse John yet, but the quiet suspicions were growing louder with every passing minute. The facts didn't add up, and the more he looked at John, the more Monroe became convinced that Tina's disappearance was not an accident. It was deliberate. Detective Monroe had felt the tension in his gut for days now. The quiet suspicion surrounding John Sandoval had turned into something more, something darker. Every piece of evidence led him to believe that Tina's disappearance was no accident, and the more he probed, the more disturbing it became. It was the cemetery that first caught his attention. There was something about the way John had mentioned it during his interviews that seemed off. His words about visiting for peace seemed rehearsed, almost too perfect. Monroe knew that to find the truth, he had to go back to where John's story began. Monroe returned to the cemetery with his team in tow. The cold, overcast sky added an eerie weight to the place. It felt like it had been too long since anyone had come here with genuine purpose. Monroe wasn't just there to follow a hunch. He was there to uncover the hidden layers of deception that had been meticulously built over years. The gravesite that had caught his attention was now under close examination. What appeared to be a standard tombstone looked different. There was a subtle shift in the soil around it. Something wasn't right. Monroe knelt beside the grave, staring at the disturbed earth. The markers of an ordinary grave were not so irregular. This one, however, had been tampered with. The forensic team arrived and began their work, carefully scraping away the dirt. The quiet hum of their equipment was the only sound that accompanied Monroe's growing unease. They worked in silence, each of them knowing the significance of what they might find. Every inch of the disturbed grave felt like a step closer to an unspeakable truth. Then it happened. As the soil was cleared, the outline of a human body started to take shape beneath the surface. Monroe's heart raced as the team revealed more, and finally, the truth hit him with a force that felt impossible. There, beneath a grave that wasn't hers, lay Tina Sandoval. The body was carefully covered, but the damage was evident. It was obvious that Tina hadn't just disappeared. She had been murdered. The evidence was undeniable. Her life had been taken from her, and now the man she had called her husband had played a role in making her vanish into the earth. Monroe stood there, his mind racing. Why had John chosen to bury Tina in such a hidden, calculated way? Why had he chosen this grave, this place? As he looked down at Tina's body, an image flashed in his mind. John, walking through the cemetery, planning every step, as if it were part of an elaborate, twisted escape. This wasn't just the act of a husband who had snapped. This was premeditation. The question now was not whether John had done it. The question was how far he had gone to cover his tracks. Was this planned months ago? Or had something finally driven John to take that irreversible step? As Monroe stood over Tina's grave, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the past few days pressing in on him. The interviews, the clues, the subtle inconsistencies, they were all leading to one conclusion. John had killed Tina, and now it was up to Monroe to piece together the final steps of how it all happened. The truth was within reach, but it wasn't going to be easy to expose. John had been careful, methodical even, but one thing had been overlooked: the cemetery, the very place where John had tried to bury his darkest secret. As Monroe stared at Tina's body, he made a silent vow. He would bring John to justice, no more lies, no more hiding. The truth was about to come out. Detective Monroe sat in his car, staring at the file on his dashboard. The information inside was starting to make more sense, but the deeper he dug into John Sandoval's past, the more disturbing it became. There were pieces of the puzzle that had yet to fall into place. He needed to understand the full picture, the man behind the mask. John's calm demeanor in the face of Tina's disappearance had been troubling enough, but what Monroe uncovered about John's history was even more alarming. It wasn't just that John had been distant, it was that his entire life had been marked by secrets, lies, and a string of manipulative relationships. Monroe contacted John's old acquaintances, digging into his past. A phone call with a former coworker revealed something that sent a chill through Monroe. John was never one to let anyone get too close, the coworker explained, his voice cautious. He had a tendency to control people. I always got the sense he was hiding something. Monroe took notes, his mind working through the implications of what he was hearing. If John had been controlling in his previous relationships, it wasn't just a one-time pattern. It was a lifestyle. As Monroe's investigation continued, he found himself uncovering disturbing details about John's past. He was no stranger to domestic violence. Previous relationships had ended abruptly, and in each of them, the ex-partners had described similar dynamics. John was domineering, secretive, and quick to anger. Monroe found a chilling detail. John had been arrested for assault in his 20s, but the charges were mysteriously dropped. It was a pattern, one that extended into his marriage with Tina. Monroe reached out to more people from John's past, and it became clear that the violence wasn't confined to the boundaries of romantic relationships. John had a history of volatile behavior. He'd been known to explode over minor things, intimidating friends and family with his unpredictable anger. As Monroe dug deeper, he found more evidence of the abuse that had taken place in John and Tina's marriage. Statements from friends painted a grim picture. Tina had been trapped, isolated from others, and subjected to John's cruelty in ways she had never openly discussed. The more Monroe learned, the more he understood Tina's silence, her reluctance to seek help. She had been afraid, unable to escape the grip of her husband's emotional and physical control. Monroe met with Tina's closest friend, Sarah, again. She had been hesitant to speak at first, but now with the weight of the investigation behind her, Sarah was more forthcoming. I saw the signs, she said, her voice breaking. I knew she was afraid of him. I just didn't realize how bad it had gotten. She was too scared to leave. He controlled everything, their finances, her friends, where she went. Monroe's heart sank. The pieces were starting to align. Tina had been living in fear for so long, and yet, even with all the warning signs, no one had intervened in time. The more he learned, the clearer it became that John wasn't just a husband who'd snapped. No, this was someone who had been building towards this moment for years. Tina's murder wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of control, manipulation, and violence. What John had done to Tina wasn't just about the moment of murder. It was about a lifetime of abuse, leading to that one moment when he felt he had nothing left to lose. The twisted logic of his mind, the sense of ownership over Tina's life, had led him to the darkest conclusion possible. She had to die for him to be free. Monroe stood outside the house, feeling the weight of the case press down on him. The hidden past that John had tried so desperately to keep buried was finally coming to light. But there was still so much more to uncover. Why did John kill Tina? What drove him to such extremes? And why, after everything, had he been so brazen about it? The answers were within reach, but Monroe knew that the truth would not come easily. He would have to dig deeper, into the past, into John's psyche, and unravel the full story. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear. John Sandoval had been hiding much more than just Tina's body. He had been hiding the true nature of his cruelty all along. Detective Monroe had always known that the truth lay buried beneath the surface. But now, as he stared at the growing pile of evidence in front of him, it felt as though the weight of the investigation was suffocating him. The more he uncovered about John Sandoval, the clearer it became that this case was about far more than just a wife's disappearance. It was about years of control, manipulation, and violence that had festered in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to explode. Monroe sat at his desk, flipping through the reports, when he came across something that sent a chill through him. The history of abuse in John and Tina's marriage wasn't just limited to their recent troubles. It went back years to the very beginning of their relationship. There were whispers in the files, small clues that Tina had suffered long before the events of October 1995. It was hard to imagine, but the more Monroe read, the more the pattern became undeniable. John had been abusive for as long as anyone could remember. John's temper, his need to control every aspect of Tina's life, it had all been building toward this moment. Monroe had always suspected that something was off, but the depth of the manipulation and cruelty was staggering. John had not just snapped, he had been playing a long game, carefully orchestrating his life, and Tina's, to fit his needs. The more Monroe dug, the more disturbing things became. Witness after witness recalled how John would isolate Tina from friends and family, making her feel as though she had no one to turn to. His jealousy over her relationships, her independence, it was all part of a calculated plan to break her down, to make her feel dependent on him. Tina had been trapped, and the more Monroe uncovered, the more he could see the chilling truth of what had happened. There was something else that troubled him: John's financial situation. When Monroe started looking into their finances, it became clear that John was in deep trouble. Tina had been the one holding everything together, managing their money, keeping the family afloat. But it wasn't enough. John's mounting debts and reckless spending had pushed him to the brink. He needed Tina out of the picture, not just for his own twisted sense of control, but because she was the one thing standing between him and a clean slate. The life insurance policy he had taken out on her was just another piece of the puzzle. Monroe had always suspected John's financial instability was a factor, but now it was clear. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated murder born out of desperation. As Monroe sat there, absorbing the weight of it all, he realized just how long this had been in the making. Tina had been more than just a victim of a violent husband. She had been a pawn in a game John had been playing for years. Her life had been carefully manipulated, controlled, and ultimately taken from her to satisfy his own twisted desires. But there was something else Monroe had uncovered in his research, a chilling new revelation. A friend of Tina's, someone who had been close to her for years, came forward with a crucial detail. She had received a phone call from Tina just days before her disappearance. Tina had been terrified. She had mentioned that she feared for her life, that John had been increasingly volatile in the days leading up to October 19th. The conversation had been brief, but it had been enough to leave the friend with a sinking feeling that Tina was in danger. She had even asked the friend to keep her location private in case John found out. That phone call, the last one Tina made, was now a lifeline in the case. It was the final piece Monroe needed to understand the full scope of John's control. The truth was now undeniable. John Sandoval had killed Tina, but the story didn't end there. This was the story of a man who had manipulated, controlled, and destroyed a woman's life. And now, it was Monroe's job to bring the truth to light. As Monroe sat back, exhausted from the weight of it all, he knew the next steps would be crucial. John was still out there, still trying to keep his life intact, still pretending that everything was normal. But Monroe could feel the net closing around him. The truth was out there, buried beneath the surface, and John Sandoval would have nowhere left to hide. The interview room was stark and silent, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly. Detective Monroe sat across from John Sandoval, who had been silent for what felt like an eternity. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. John sat with his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the table, avoiding eye contact with Monroe. The indifference that had marked his earlier responses was now gone. He shifted uneasily in his seat, his earlier composure slipping. Monroe leaned forward, studying him carefully. "You've been lying to me, John," Monroe said quietly, the weight of the words hanging in the air. "We know what you did. We know how you buried her. Tina didn't leave you, did she? You killed her." John's face tightened, and for the first time, a flicker of something passed across his features: anger, guilt, regret. But it was brief. He quickly regained his composure, his voice low and controlled. "I didn't kill her," John replied, his voice cold. "It was an accident. She pushed me to the edge. I didn't mean for it to happen." Monroe's heart sank. This wasn't the confession he had been hoping for, but it was something. It was a crack in John's carefully constructed facade. He had finally broken, but not enough. Not yet. "Accident?" Monroe's voice sharpened. "You killed her, John. You buried her in a cemetery under a different grave. That's not an accident. That's premeditated. John's eyes darted toward the window, his face pale. He exhaled sharply, almost as if the truth was choking him, but he still held back. Monroe knew he wasn't finished. Monroe leaned back, his voice softer now. Tell me what really happened, John. Why did you kill her? What made you think you could get away with it? John's eyes flickered with something that seemed like fear, mixed with an odd sense of relief. He shifted in his chair again, avoiding Monroe's gaze. The room felt heavy with his silence. I didn't want it to go this far, John began, his voice barely above a whisper. She was going to leave me. She had everything, her career, her family, and I couldn't let her go. I couldn't lose her. Monroe's stomach turned, but he stayed calm, his mind racing. You didn't have to kill her, John. You didn't have to bury her like that. John looked up, his eyes locking with Monroe's for the first time. There was a hardness in his gaze, a chilling coldness. She was never going to leave me. She was mine, he said flatly. I made sure of it. She wasn't going anywhere. Monroe felt the air grow colder. John's confession was disturbing in its bluntness, but the underlying sense of entitlement was even more terrifying. John had controlled Tina's life, and in the end he had decided to take it. But just as Monroe began to process the confession, something unexpected happened. John's face shifted again, a flicker of panic overtaking his earlier bravado. I didn't mean to kill her. Not at first, John muttered, almost as if talking to himself. But she kept pushing me. She was going to leave. I couldn't let her go. I couldn't. Monroe leaned forward, sensing the opening. What happened, John? What did she say to you? John paused, his eyes lost in thought. He seemed to struggle with his words, but then, with a sudden rush, he spoke again. I didn't want to hurt her, but she kept saying she was done, that I'd never change. She was going to take the kids. I lost control. I just snapped. She wouldn't shut up, and then I couldn't stop. Monroe's breath caught in his chest. This wasn't just a confession, it was a window into John's twisted mind, but something wasn't adding up. If John had truly snapped, why the meticulous planning? Why bury her under a grave, hide her body like a piece of trash? You're lying, John, Monroe said, his voice low and insistent. This wasn't just a moment of anger. You planned this. You thought this through. John's expression faltered. I didn't plan it, but when I saw her leave that morning, I knew it was over. I couldn't let her go. She wasn't going anywhere. Monroe felt a cold chill run through him as he connected the dots. This wasn't just about a wife leaving her husband. This was about a man who believed he had the right to control every aspect of someone else's life, to the point of murder. Just as Monroe opened his mouth to speak, John cut him off with a final twist. There's something else. Something you don't know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't the only one. There's more to this. There are people who helped me cover it up. You're looking in the wrong direction. Monroe's heart skipped a beat. What was John implying? Who else was involved? The silence in the interrogation room was almost suffocating. Detective Monroe sat across from John Sandoval, the weight of the case pressing down on him. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment where John would finally break, where the truth would come pouring out. But John, despite his earlier confession, still held back. His eyes were cold, his posture rigid, as if he were bracing for something. But Monroe wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. You said there were others involved, John, Monroe said, leaning forward. Who helped you? You've barely scratched the surface of what happened. You're not fooling me. John didn't respond immediately. His gaze shifted to the window, and for a moment Monroe thought he might have lost him. But then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, John finally spoke, his voice low and strained. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, John murmured, his words almost drowned out by the hum of the lights overhead. I didn't want to do it, not really. But when she said she was leaving, when she said it was over, I knew I couldn't let her. I couldn't let her take everything. Monroe's pulse quickened, his mind already putting the pieces together. John's motivations had always been about control, about power. But this was different. There was something more to it, something that John wasn't saying. Who else, John? Monroe pressed, his voice calm but insistent. You said there were others. I need names. John's expression flickered with what could have been fear or maybe guilt. Monroe couldn't tell which, but it didn't matter. He needed the truth. John exhaled deeply, his hands trembling as they rested on the table. I had to make sure she stayed. I couldn't let her ruin everything, not after all this time. His eyes glazed over as if recalling the moment that changed everything. I didn't want her to leave, but when I knew she was serious, I knew what I had to do. Monroe watched him closely, trying to understand the full scope of his twisted logic. "And that's when you killed her," Monroe said, his voice almost a whisper. "But there's more to this. You didn't just snap, did you? You planned it. You buried her in the cemetery like she was nothing." John's face hardened. "I had to make sure she never left me. No one else would understand. No one knew what she had done to me. It was always her pushing me. I couldn't let her go. Not like that." Monroe felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he realized the full extent of John's manipulation. This wasn't just about a moment of weakness. This wasn't about rage that got out of control. This was something far darker. John had planned this meticulously. He had orchestrated her murder, hidden her body under someone else's grave, and lived a lie for weeks, all while playing the role of the concerned husband. But then came the twist. John's eyes, which had been cold and distant for most of the interrogation, suddenly widened. His lips parted as if he were about to speak, but no sound came out at first. Monroe leaned in, sensing that something was about to break. "I didn't want to hurt anyone else," John finally confessed, his voice trembling. "But she wasn't the only one who knew. She had told someone." Monroe's mind raced. Told someone? Who? Who else knew John? John's gaze shifted, and for a moment Monroe thought he saw a flicker of genuine fear. "There's someone else involved, someone who helped me cover it up. They made sure no one would find out. They knew what I was doing, and they wanted it to stay hidden." Monroe's heart skipped a beat. This was the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. John hadn't acted alone. There were more people involved in this twisted plot, and Monroe was determined to uncover the full truth. "Who helped you, John?" Monroe demanded, his voice hardening. "Who else was involved? I need to know." John hesitated for a long time, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. But there was no escape now. Finally, John spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't say their name," he muttered, his hands shaking more violently now. "They made me promise, but you'll find them. You have to. They're the ones who made it all possible." Monroe felt a chill settle in his bones. This case was far from over. John's confession had opened a door, but it had also revealed that there were deeper, darker secrets still waiting to be uncovered. Monroe wasn't sure if he could trust everything John had said, but he knew one thing for sure. The truth was still out there, and he was going to find it. The courtroom was packed, the tension palpable in the air. The once quiet community of Greeley now buzzed with whispers and murmurs as people filled the seats, eager for justice to be served. The trial of John Sandoval had begun. Monroe sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as the attorneys prepared for the opening statements. John sat at the defense table, his face grim, but his eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. He had remained stoic throughout the investigation, but now, in front of the world, his facade was cracking. The walls were closing in, and everyone knew it. The prosecutor, an experienced and no-nonsense attorney named Rachel Grant, stood up first. She addressed the court with a calm, commanding voice, her words deliberate as she painted the picture of Tina's tragic, final moments. "Tina Sandoval was a mother, a wife, and a daughter," Rachel began, her gaze fixed on the jury. "She was a woman who had the right to live her life in peace, free from fear, but instead she was controlled, manipulated, and ultimately murdered by the person who promised to love and protect her. That person is John Sandoval." Rachel's words hung in the air as the room fell silent. She proceeded to detail the evidence that had been gathered, the forensic findings, the witness testimonies, the chilling discovery of Tina's body buried under a grave in a cemetery. The evidence against John was irrefutable, but the real kicker was the confession he had given to Monroe, which had set the case in motion. But as Rachel spoke, a subtle shift in the room occurred. John's defense attorney, Thomas Richardson, a seasoned lawyer with a sharp reputation, stood up to make his case. He was ready to fight for his client's freedom, and he knew this wasn't going to be easy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Thomas began, his voice smooth and confident, "what we are being presented with here is not the full picture. Yes, my client admits to the tragic death of his wife, but it was not premeditated murder. It was a tragic, unfortunate accident. John Sandoval is not a monster. He is a man who lost control in a moment of intense emotion." The defense attorney's words were carefully chosen, designed to provoke doubt in the minds of the jurors. He spoke of John's troubled childhood, his financial struggles, and the emotional strain that had built up in the months leading up to Tina's death. He painted John as a man who had been pushed to his breaking point, a man who had snapped in the heat of a violent argument. But the prosecution wasn't buying it, and neither was the jury. Rachel Grant stood firm, ready to tear apart the defense's narrative with cold, hard facts. She began calling witnesses to the stand, each one more damning than the last. Neighbors who had witnessed John's violent outbursts, friends who described Tina's growing fear. And then there was the final blow, the testimony of Sarah, Tina's closest friend, who recounted Tina's last conversation before she disappeared. "I told her to leave him," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she stood before the court. She said she couldn't, that John would never let her go. She was scared, and she didn't know what to do. Sarah's testimony hit the jury like a sledgehammer. It was clear now, Tina had been trapped, not just physically but emotionally and mentally, by a man who saw her as property, not as a partner. John's face reddened as he sat in his chair, eyes darting nervously around the room. For the first time, he looked as though the reality of his situation was sinking in. This wasn't just a trial, it was his life on the line. Monroe, watching from the back, felt the weight of the moment. He had been in law enforcement for years, but the rawness of this case had affected him deeply. Tina's family, sitting in the front row, could hardly hold back their tears. They had lived with the agony of not knowing what had happened to Tina, and now the truth was being revealed in front of them. As the day wore on, both sides presented their cases with all the legal finesse they could muster. But for every defense tactic, there was a stronger counter from the prosecution. The jury was listening carefully, and Monroe knew that this was it, the culmination of all the hard work, all the effort that had gone into this investigation. When the jury was sent to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. John sat motionless, his hands trembling slightly, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. His attorney sat beside him, whispering something in his ear, but it was clear that it was too late for persuasion. The truth had already been laid bare. Minutes felt like hours. Monroe could hear the ticking of the clock, each second stretching out with an unbearable sense of finality. Finally, the jury returned, and everyone in the room stood as the foreman delivered the verdict. "John Sandoval, we find you guilty of second-degree murder." The word struck like a blow. John's face turned pale, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but Monroe felt a wave of quiet relief wash over him. Justice had been served, but the price had been too high. Tina Sandoval would never return, and the pain her family had endured would never fully heal. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed in, their faces a mixture of determination and fatigue. The tension was unbearable. John Sandoval sat at the defense table, his hands folded tightly in front of him, his eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't spoken since the verdict was read aloud, and now his future hung in the balance. His defense attorney, Thomas Richardson, sat beside him, his expression unreadable. The prosecution, led by Rachel Grant, stood confidently, having laid out a compelling case for John's guilt. Monroe stood near the back of the room, watching as the jury settled into their seats. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of weeks, months of work. This wasn't just a trial. This was the end of a long, painful journey for Tina's family. It was the final chapter of a tragedy that had torn apart a life, a family, and an entire community. The judge called the room to order, and the foreman of the jury stood. Everyone in the room, from the gallery to the defense table, held their breath. The moment they had all been waiting for was here. The foreman cleared his throat, his voice steady as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, we the jury find the defendant, John Sandoval, guilty of second-degree murder." The words rang out, sending shockwaves through the room. Monroe could see the look of disbelief on John's face. His eyes widened as though the verdict had just struck him like a physical blow. The emotion that had been so carefully concealed behind his cold demeanor for the past few weeks had finally broken through. John's jaw clenched, but he didn't say a word. Tina's family, sitting in the front row, exchanged looks of quiet relief. The tears that had been held back for so long began to flow freely. It wasn't the ultimate justice they had hoped for, but it was justice. Tina's life had been taken too soon, and while nothing could ever bring her back, the conviction of her killer brought a measure of peace. As the court continued to process the verdict, Rachel Grant turned to face the Sandoval family, offering a small but sincere smile. The battle wasn't over yet. but they had won the first most important victory. They had seen the truth revealed in front of the world, and now the man who had taken Tina's life would pay for his crime. John's attorney stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we request that the defendant be allowed to remain free on bail pending sentencing." The words hung in the air, but they seemed almost irrelevant at this point. The verdict had been delivered. The wheels of justice were turning. The judge looked down at John, who still hadn't spoken, and nodded. "Bail will be revoked. The defendant will remain in custody until sentencing." With that, the judge turned to the gallery. "The court will reconvene in 1 week for sentencing. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell, and the room erupted in a mix of emotions. Tina's family stood, their eyes red from crying but filled with a quiet sense of relief. They had waited so long for this moment, and now it was finally here. They had fought for Tina, and they had won. Monroe felt a knot in his stomach loosen. It was over. The investigation had been long, difficult, and filled with moments of doubt and uncertainty, but now the truth was undeniable. John Sandoval had been held accountable for his actions. He had taken Tina's life, but in the end, it was he who had been trapped by his own lies. As the crowd began to disperse, Monroe caught Rachel Grant's eye and gave her a nod of acknowledgement. She had been relentless in her pursuit of justice for Tina, and the victory was as much hers as it was anyone else's. But there was something else, something still gnawing at Monroe. John's final words had hinted at something deeper, someone else involved. The twist that had come at the end of his confession still lingered in Monroe's mind. Was there someone else out there? Someone who had helped him cover it all up? The case was closed, but the question remained. For now, though, the verdict had been reached. John Sandoval was guilty, and the long road to justice had finally come to an end. Monroe turned to leave, but as he did, he glanced over at Tina's family, knowing that they would never fully heal from this loss, but they could at least begin the difficult process of moving forward. The finality of the moment settled in. John Sandoval was going to prison, but for Tina, it was too late. The courtroom was nearly empty now, the echoes of the trial's closing still hanging in the air. The Sandoval case had come to its conclusion, but for Detective Monroe, the real work had only just begun. He stood outside the courthouse, his gaze lost in thought as he stared out at the busy street ahead. The weight of the trial's outcome was heavy, but it was the silence after the verdict that haunted him. John Sandoval was headed to prison, but Tina Sandoval would never return. Her life had been taken far too soon, her story reduced to a tragic chapter in the pages of a family's grief. But the verdict, though just, didn't feel like closure. It was a grim resolution to an unfolding nightmare that had torn apart everything Tina had once known. Monroe had always known that justice didn't bring back the dead. It didn't undo the hurt, the pain, or the loss. It didn't fix the broken pieces of a family left behind. But in the case of Tina Sandoval, there was something even more crushing. The truth had been exposed. Every brutal detail of her life and death had been revealed in court. Yet, despite everything, it felt as though nothing had changed. John's conviction wouldn't bring Tina back. Nothing could. Monroe thought of Tina's children. They were too young to fully grasp the weight of their mother's death, yet old enough to feel the emptiness of losing her. It was the kind of loss that scarred the soul, leaving its mark on every corner of their lives. They would grow up without the love and protection of their mother. It was a reality that couldn't be erased, no matter how many years passed. As Monroe walked away from the courthouse, his thoughts drifted to Tina's family. Her parents, who had been present at every moment of the trial, had not just lost their daughter, they had lost the future they had dreamed of for her. It wasn't just about the funeral or the burial. It was the knowledge that her life had been stolen from them so brutally and senselessly. The pain of their grief was raw, unspoken, but it was there in every step they took. And then there was John, a man who, despite all his attempts at deception and manipulation, had finally been exposed for who he truly was. But even now, as he sat behind bars, the question remained, was justice truly served? He was guilty, yes, but the consequences of his actions would forever linger. His conviction wouldn't erase the past. It wouldn't fix the destruction he'd wrought on Tina's life or on the lives of those who had loved her. Monroe couldn't help but feel the emptiness settle in as he replayed the trial in his mind. The confession, the pieces of evidence that had come together to paint a picture of control, abuse, and murder. John had been exposed for what he was. Yet the more Monroe thought about it, the more he realized that the verdict hadn't truly answered the most important question. Why? Why had John done this? What had driven him to kill the woman he had once sworn to love? What had truly been going on behind closed doors? John's motives had been revealed to some extent: his need for control, his jealousy, his belief that Tina was his property. But the deeper, darker motivations still remained hidden beneath the surface. For all the evidence, for all the years of abuse, the full picture of John's mind would never be fully understood. Monroe stopped walking and looked up at the sky. It was a beautiful day, almost mocking in its tranquility. Tina would never see another sunrise. Her life had been stolen by the very person who had promised to protect her. She had lived in fear, and in the end, she had paid the ultimate price. It was then that Monroe realized something even more profound. It wasn't just about bringing John to justice. It was about remembering Tina. It was about keeping her memory alive, not letting her become another statistic or forgotten victim. Justice had been served, but the cost had been too high. Tina's family, her friends, and her children would carry the scars of her loss forever. The verdict wouldn't change that. Monroe took a deep breath, steeling himself for the long road ahead. This wasn't over, not yet. Tina had been lost, but the fight for her memory would continue. He turned away from the courthouse and headed towards his car, knowing that he couldn't change the past. But he could make sure that the story of Tina Sandoval wasn't forgotten. It was the least he could do. What do you think of John Sandoval's actions and the shocking twists in this case? Do you believe justice was truly served? Or is there more to the story that we haven't uncovered yet? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories and to stay updated on our latest videos. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new episode.